HP Service Manager 9.3, Process Designer Overview and Demo. Today's webinar is brought to you by Vivit, HP Service Manager Special Interest Group. My name is Mary Kay Peterson. I'm the Director of Metagraphics in charge of Service Management and Enterprise Security. I have two chapter leaders, Martine and Flores, that are not with us today. Today's presenter is Eric Kruger, who is a principal consultant from Stratacom and focuses in ITSM. This session today is being recorded, and the recording will be available to all Vivit members. Eric will present, and during the course of the presentation, you're welcome to type questions into the question pane of GoToMeeting. You can do that by typing your question in the pane below, and we will answer Q&A at the end. And with that, I will pass the mic over to Eric, who will talk to us about Process Designer.
Okay, good morning. This is Eric Kruger. We're going to be talking about Process Designer. So I know a lot of people signed up for this, and to make it as informative as possible, I put a lot of the information into slides, lots of screenshots, so I'll kind of be going back and forth between the slide presentation and a live demo, but I wanted to make sure that everybody had something that they could refer to. So you'll be able to get this slide presentation off the Vivit website, and I wanted to put as much information as I talked about as I could into the slide presentation, so you could just look through the slide presentation and get a lot of the meat out of it instead of having to listen through the hour. So I'm going to try to keep it to about 45 minutes so we have time for questions. I'm willing to go over and answer questions, and I can follow up written answers to questions if we just run completely out of time. So what is the HP Service Manager Process Designer? So the Process Designer is a brand new tool designed to control workflow, and it was released in Service Manager 9.30. Currently, there are two Service Manager modules that support the Process Designer, and those are Knowledge Management and Change Management. So Knowledge Management was released, the Process Designer was released for Knowledge Management with 9.30, and Change came out a little bit later. It came out, I believe, in November or December of last year. So it's only been out for a few months, and I'll talk about that a little later. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what about the other modules? If there's a pause, I can just talk too.
Okay.
So HP will be releasing this workflow engine for the rest of the other Service Manager modules. Even modules like Incident Management that do not have quote-unquote workflow like phases, like a lot of the other modules do, can use the Process Designer to manage at least their rule sets. But in theory, it would be possible to add workflows to incidents. So we don't really know what incident is going to look like. HP can't really give a lot of guidance. I'm not with HP, so I can speculate, but I'm guessing that they'll add a lot of the functionality that you'll see in these change screenshots to incident. A lot of the other modules already have the concept of phases, so that whole phase concept will fit right in there. So incident and interaction or service management will be a couple that might be a slightly different paradigm, but I'm guessing what they would just do is take this concept of status and apply it to a phase. Or if you wanted to apply this concept of a status to a phase, you can do that. Okay, next slide. So the next question is, how do I get this Process Designer? So Process Designer itself, and you'll see this on this next slide when it comes up, the Process Designer itself is included in Service Manager 9.30. So this whole concept of this workflow engine and these rule sets in this Process Designer is included in Service Manager 9.30. Knowledge Management, like I said before, is already included, so you already get that if you just go to 9.30. And then the Change Management Content Pack is on HP's Live network. So I've included a link to the content packs for Service Manager in this slide deck you can see on the screen. So you can use that link to download this, this content. Okay, next slide. All right, so what is a content pack and how do I install that? So these content packs can now be installed via the Application Patch Manager. The Application Patch Manager keeps track of which content packs are installed. And it also allows you to install the content packs and merge code, et cetera, just like a little mini upgrade. So basically, you download this content pack, you use the application patch manager to install it, and then it'll kind of walk you through this little kind of mini upgrade where it asks you, do you want to migrate your existing change workflows, yada, 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 and it's pretty quick. When I ran it on an out-of-the-box system, it only took me a few minutes. So if you've got an existing change implementation, it may take longer, especially if you're going to migrate workflows. Let's go to the next slide. The next slide is basically just where to install the content in Service Manager. So this is just a screenshot in Service Manager where that content is at, or how do you apply it. Okay, next slide. Okay, so let's talk about the benefits of using the Process Designer, and then let's talk about what you'll do once you install it. So I'm just going to talk a little bit theory, what this Process Designer is good for, and then we'll talk about how to get there, and then we'll actually go into the details of how this thing actually works. Okay, next slide. Okay, so there's two main parts of the Process Designer. There's the workflows, which is the graphical process workflow editor, and then there are rule sets, which you apply to the workflows. So rule sets are basically just workflow rules. All right, next slide. So workflows control the life cycle of a ticket. So for example, a change workflow or a change task workflow has a specific life cycle as it goes through from phase to phase. It has approvals, it may have some alerts, it's got transitions between the phases. So that's all controlled in the workflow. Workflows, I also call these workflows in this Process Designer the glue that holds everything together, because workflows is kind of your central palette where you design the workflow, and you can apply these rules to this workflow, and you define the transitions between the workflow. And you can, if you've got a lot of specialized code, say in process records or JavaScript libraries, you can apply those to the workflow via rules. So the workflow is kind of the glue that now holds everything together. So you can define transitions, either automatic or manual, between phases, and it allows you to apply rule sets to manage workflow rules throughout the ticket lifecycle. All right, next slide. So this is a workflow. So this is a workflow in the actual Process Designer. I believe this is HP's standard change workflow. So you can see it kind of, if you're not on 930, probably most of you that are on this aren't, or if you are, you don't have this content pack. But it's similar to how the old workflow, like on the workflow tab in the change looks. But this is actually very interactive, and you can move these phases around, and you can drag and drop transitions between phases and create new transitions and add rules to these. So before, it was just a visual representation of what the actual workflow looked like. Now it's an actual workflow that you can play with and move around, and it actually affects how the actual workflow will work. And I will say that this is a pretty new concept. I don't know if people are already using this with knowledge. Maybe they are if they're in 930. And so I am going to talk about change a little, because that's what the Process Designer is out for right now, knowledge and change. I think most people are going to find it most interesting in change. But I'm also going to speak a little more broadly just about, in general, how this thing would work, so people can think about, so everybody listening, you can think about, well, how would I apply this to incident? Maybe I don't use change. Well, it's coming for incident. It's coming for request. It's coming for all these other modules. So even though right now this is how HP is moving forward with change management, this is how HP is going to move forward with process for all the modules, or I'm assuming they won't say for sure, but I'm pretty sure this is coming out for all modules. So think about if I'm going to implement 930, do I want to do change module first, or do I want to wait until it comes up for incident and do that? Okay.
Sorry.
So the interesting thing about the way that HP is releasing these content packs is that because the core code for this process designer already exists in 930, once you're on 930, you can use this this core code, and then you can apply these content packs in whatever order you want. So if they come out with problem management next, for example, I don't know if they are, but if they are, and you didn't want to do change, but you wanted to do process designer for problem management, you could just apply the problem management content pack. So these content packs aren't reliant on one another. So if you wanted to roll out 930 and you wanted to keep change, you didn't want to touch change, but you had maybe a more minimal incident implementation, and the incident content pack comes out. You can apply that content pack for incident, and then your changes will stay as is, but you can design and develop new incident workflow or migrate your existing workflow into the incident workflow. And it also works with existing workflow. So for example, when I migrated even the out-of-the-box changes, some of the rules that were in format control still fired because they didn't get migrated to the new process designer. So as I was adding rules, if I removed a field from a form and there was still a rule in the format control for it, I had to go back into the format control and remove that rule. So process designer also works with existing rules.
Okay, I think we're on slide 11.
There we go, rule sets. So let's talk about, so we talked a little bit about what the workflow is. Workflow basically is the glue that holds everything together. It consists of phases and transitions. Rule sets are the other big part of the process designer. So rule sets allow you to create workflow rules via a graphically driven rules engine. And keep in mind, this is new functionality. So this doesn't really relate to, there's nothing like this like in 6 or 7 or even 920. So this is new in 930. Rule sets can be applied to workflows independently of each other. So for example, if you've got 8 change scenarios and you have very specific rules for each change scenario, in the existing tool set or pre-930, you may put a rule, say, in the CM3R format control, and then you had to define, say, for which category that rule was for, or even for which phase in which category that rule was for. So you ended up kind of mishing and mashing all these rules together, kind of all in the same place, potentially. And with this, you can apply them to workflows independently of each other. So if you create a rule that's just for a specific type of change, and you apply it to that change workflow, you're not going to have to worry about that change rule firing for another workflow, because that workflow just doesn't have access to that rule set if it's not on that workflow. And rule sets can be reused across multiple workflows as long as they're in the same module. So any change rule that you create, you can use across multiple workflows. If you've got if you have a rule that says, hey, these 16 fields are required, no matter what change workflow someone's in, you can create a single rule set with the validations for the 16 fields, and then you can apply that rule to all of your change scenarios. So you write the rule once, and then if a year from now you decide, hey, I want to add a 17th field that's going to be required for all changes, you just go edit that rule set, add that field, and then it's automatically applied to all the different workflows. Okay, next. Okay, so the rule sets do replace some functionality, and so some of this is actually replacing functionality, but it's not actually replacing objects in Service Manager. So, for example, the rule sets replace functionality and format controls, but it doesn't replace the format controls. So the format controls are still there. You can still use format controls if you want. A lot of the functionality is moved into this rule set. So, for example, in format controls, you have calculations, queries, validations, subroutines. These can all be added to rule sets now. So you don't have to manage these format control, this format control code anymore if you don't want to. And for me, as an implementer / developer, the format controls are kind of messy to manage. They're tough to document. You know, you can have a lot of rules in a format control. They're tough to search. You know, if you want to find a variable, it's very difficult to find. Sure, you can use *A, find that string to find what format controls they're in, but then it's very difficult to find exactly in the format control where that is. So This does make some of that a little bit easier to manage because you're actually putting it in these rule sets. Replaces functionality and triggers. So you have after successful update, you've got the old record, new record like you have in triggers, process records. And so the process records, a lot of the code that maybe you would have in a process record where you're doing this and then going to the next process record, you can replace that functionality in rule sets. Now, interestingly, a lot of these things like process records, you can still call from rule sets. So if you have process records that do very specific things, like maybe they run a server-side executable, or maybe they run a bunch of wizards that you want it run in a row, you can actually add a process record as a rule to a rule set. Display screens, so they replace a lot of the functionality in display screens, and display options like the buttons and more options. All these can be replaced with these rule sets. All right, next slide. All right, so they replace functionality. Yeah, they do. So now they have the capability to perform many of the same things that other parts of SM can do, and they can still work together, like I mentioned before. So the rule sets, from what I've seen, the rule sets mostly fire first, and then it goes through the rest of the normal processing. So, for example, if you have a validation, all your validations in the rule sets will fire first, and then your validations in your format control will fire after that. Okay, next slide. So how am I going to go about implementing this thing? Well, rule sets in this graphical workflow can be used in addition to existing rules. So, however, the existing code cannot be uncoupled from new workflows. So eventually you'll probably have to end up moving all your rules to the new rule set functionality. So, and what I mean from that is that if you've got existing code, like in a format control, you can't uncouple that from a workflow. So if you've got a change workflow that's entirely different from all of your other change workflows, let's say a change workflow that maybe you're doing some almost service catalog type stuff with, maybe just assigning it out for somebody to install memory or something like that, just completely different than a change workflow. You can't uncouple that change workflows from, say, format controls. You can't say, hey, don't use the CM3R format control, or don't use triggers, or don't use some of these other things. So if you've got rules in there that you want to keep, say, in format control, and you create a new workflow, you're going to have to keep your old rules in mind. So that's why I suggest you're probably just going to want to end up moving all these rules to the rules engine eventually, sooner, if not later. All right, so that sounds like a lot of work, right? I got to move all my existing rules into this new tool. Well, some of it will happen automatically. So some of the workflow will move in. Phases and transitions are automatically added to the graphical workflow editor. And some of it you might have to do manually. There's no good automated way to pull code out of, say, a format control and add it to this new workflow tool. And so, there's no great way to pull the validations out, parse through them, and then add them to this new like wizard-driven rules engine. But I think it is going to be worth it. So long-term maintenance of the workflow and rule sets is going to be greatly simplified, and changing rules and workflows is going to be a lot easier. So even building these rules, a lot of companies may have problems because they don't have somebody that's adept at programming, and sometimes even for simple format control validations, if you need to do do some checking, you have to know a little bit about coding. If you don't know about coding, it's hard to do or difficult to do. Or if you have somebody that's new, you have to go dig through this code. Or this is more wizard-driven. So, I mean, how many times have you looked for something that's happening in Service Manager and looked through 7 or 8 different objects for that snippet of code? I mean, it happens all the time, especially if you're working on somebody else's system or you're new to a system. You're trying to find, like, when is this variable being set, or when is this wizard being fired? My goodness, this wizard's popping up and I can't figure it out. And I mean, I can only, there's only, well, it could be a process record, or it could be a format control, or it could be one of a couple different spots in a format control, or it could be, where else could it be coming from, or where did this button come from? What state am I in? What all these different things that you have to know in order to work down through to find this code. So now you're going to have a central point to look for workflow rules. If something happens on save, you just check the save or update or after successful save tabs in the workflow. If there's a button that does something and you want to change it, there's no more looking up the button ID, what button number is this? I go to the object record. Okay, what state am I in? I have to find the state record, and then find the action and display actions that's firing on the state that's tied back to that the button ID is actually doing. Now I can just look in this workflow editor. So now that I have demo, I can actually go into it and look at it. So if I'm looking at something, this is just a generic workflow. I've just laid out some phases. If I want to look at something that's happening, say, in the implementation phase, I can't figure out something's going on in the implementation phase, I can see, for example, my rule sets when they fire. If I know something's happening on this transition, when I click this button, something is happening from my third phase to my implementation phase. I can see all the rules that are happening on that transition right from here, because they're just all going to be listed right here. Okay, so I was going to show just the functionality in a live demo, but I put much of this information into the slide deck so you can reference it after this webinar. So I talked about. So I'll kind of be going back and forth, but you will have a lot of these screenshots and stuff in this slide demo. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these workflows. You cannot edit an HP workflow, so there are workflows called HP workflows. And HP workflows have a designation of HP next to them. So you can't really change these. HP doesn't want these to be changed. These are best practice workflows that HP provides for these different modules, and they follow ITIL. So the workflows included with this content pack are actually new. They're all redesigned to use the process designer, and they're based on ITIL best practices. So if you do want to use one of their workflows and change it, what you do is just make a copy of it, and then whatever change that's tied to, you just change it in the change. So it's very simple. So you can just make a copy of it. And the reason HP has done this is that well, I think mostly for upgrade capabilities. So if people want to use the out-of-the-box change workflows or whatever other workflows they come with that HP comes out with, HP can be assured, hey, I can change these workflows, and when it comes to upgrade, people aren't going to have to worry about their workflows getting overwritten, because any workflow they have is going to be, customized or tailored for their own. So if they want some of the new functionality, we can put it in an HP workflow, and then they can either make a copy of that, or they can move some of the functionality out of the HP workflow into their own workflow. So workflows have two main features: phases and transitions. So phase, let me pull up my workflow. And one of the first things you'll notice if you download this or have a site you can go to is that you have to double click on the actual workflow to get it to come up. And workflow editor only works in the web client, does not work out of the Windows client. So rules editor does, Windows client, but not workflow editor. So to edit a workflow, a lot of times in Windows client, you can just single click on something, and this you just double click to pull it up. Okay, so workflows have phases, which are these, and also transitions, which are these. So to create a phase, you can either just click the add phase, or you can just do a transition from an existing phase. You basically just click on it, drag it out, and it creates a new phase. So these phase records are actually just phase records, graphically represented. So this is one of the overlapping functionalities, where it's new functionality, but it's based on an actual database record. So this additional phase information button will just take you to the phase record. Okay, so the phases have a few different tabs. I'm just going to run through these tabs, see what's on them. So the details tab, who can edit it? Is it active? Is it the first phase? Make it the default phase. What form can I use on this phase? What rule sets can I use? So it's got the rule sets fire on enter of the phase, on exit, so when you leave the phase. So these are kind of new. There's not really a good, I guess the analogy would be kind of in a process record. When you enter this change phase or when you leave the change phase, you can do pre-rad, post-rad. So this maybe replaces that. It's kind of kind of a conglomeration of a few other things too. But so when you enter the change phase, when you exit the change phase, initialization, this is basically the same as like the format control init box where you put true, false, or put a condition in there. On display, this is the same as the format control display, so it gets fired basically when the screen is drawn, and then every time you do a fill, some other, after save, some other things, anything that basically redraws the screen. On update, so this is basically the same as a format control update. So when you click save, basically, that fires. And then after successful update, so this is kind of new. I mean, I guess technically if I'm looking for a successful update, when I'm doing change modifications, I'm either looking like at a post-update trigger, or I'm checking like $L.exit equals, whatever the exit, or dollar, that bad val is not equal true. So you're looking for a successful update. So this, you can just add a rule after successful updates. And they all have this rule sets where you can add these rule sets to these phases. So that's the rule set tab. If we go to the action phases, actions basically replace display options. So display options are still there, but if you add an action, it does not add a display option. So it's actually stored within the rules engine. So if you want to add a button to the screen, you can add it here by clicking add. So if I want to go in, if we want to look at these actions, we can look at this and click edit. And we can see some of the, like here's the action we can choose, location, do you want the tray, the more options list, or a button. There's some condition you can put, like who has access to see it basically, and then action when complete, requires a lock, yes or no. Okay, so there's a lot of functions. I'm going to try to breeze through this. I have a lot of slides, a lot of information. Phase approvals, this is basically how you add approvals to phases. So this is where you add the approval. So you can see like this has got a TCAB approval. So this is the existing approval. So if you've already got approvals, this is just where you add them. Where typically before you just add them to the phase record. Now you can just add the approvals here. So it's a little bit easier to manage. You don't have to go back to the phase record. You're kind of in one place to manage all these things, which is kind of the idea behind this tool. And also the alerts. So the alerts the same thing. Before you would add them, back phase record, but now you can just put them on this phase in the workflow editor. It's got the reset condition, the recalculate. So this is another spot where you're kind of reusing something that's there, but it's more you're using the glue of this workflow editor to add it to this workflow. So transition. So this is a picture of a transition. These are our transitions in the tool. So transitions are how you move between phases. So in an older version of Service Manager, kind of a pain to make the transitions work how you want them. So if you want an automated transition, maybe use an alert, or there's a lot of different ways to do it. And it's kind of a problem because there was a lot of different ways to do it. So what's the best way to do it? So now the transitions are very greatly simplified. To create a new transition, and there's a couple different things to use this, and I don't know how well this comes through on the webinar, but in order to create a transition from one to another, you have two mouse cursors. You have I call him grab and hold mouse cursor. He's the arrow mouse cursor. With that, you can kind of drag and move things around. And then you've got little pointy hand mouse cursor. See if I can get him to come up. When you get little pointy hand mouse cursor, that means you can click and you can drag a transition to either a brand new phase or to an existing phase. So if I want to take this registration categorization phase, drag it to execution, I just drag it over there, and now I've got a phase, and I kind of move it around and make it a little bit easier to see. Okay, so that's how you do phases. So, and then you just say, hey, how do I want this phase to work? Oh, do I want it manual or automatic? Do I want it default, which is kind of automatic, but it's like the last rule that would fire on automatic. So you can have, and the way they show up in the change, they just show up as a button if you have a manual. If you have them automatic, they show up as kind of this cool little cog will show up. And then if it meets certain conditions on save, it'll automatically move it to the next phase. So that's how you do transitions right now in this new tool. Really nice. So I put some information about what's on the transition here, the type, the name, where it at, the condition, and then any rule sets are applied to the transition. So you can even have additional rule sets that apply to these transitions. So here's an example of a transition. So I've got this transition, and I've got a condition on it, and then I've got a rule set. So I think we do have a poll. Let's wait until maybe right before QA to do the poll, and then we'll do right before QA maybe in about 10 minutes, and we'll do the poll, and then I can kind of answer questions as people are going through that poll. So when you click on the transition, you can see the different things that you can do with it. Condition editor. So this is something I wanted to spend a little time on just showing you how this thing works, because this is all net new. So this is how we do conditions now in Service Manager and Process Designer. So the condition editor is used in multiple places throughout the Process Designer. So you can see right here, it says condition, when is this transition available? Click this little button, you get the transition editor. Okay, so if I go into here and I say, let's go to existing transition. It's got this condition, it's got my rules. Right now this is a manual transition. It's called close right there, okay? It's located in the tray, which will be up here. And then also the condition is down here. So if I click on this and I want to add more information in this condition, I just click Add Condition. I can do and or. Okay. It allows you to tell the process designer when something should be done, simplifies the creation of conditional logic by using a wizard-driven interface, and it's found everywhere you can apply a condition. Okay, so let's go through like using this condition. So this is when something's going to show up. So I can add a condition here. And now I can do an expression or a group. Basically an expression, just think of it as a code snippet. A group is also a code snippet, but it groups other expressions together. Okay, so let's just look at an expression. Now I've got some of this in the slideshow, but basically these are the things you have access to within this condition editor. Okay, so I've got access to a category. So the category is the category of the change, and it's actually the category record, the underlying category record. So you may want to pull some information out of the category record, check something, do something. They just gave it. I don't know how valuable it is, but current record, that's the actual, you can call this dollar file or $L file. So this is the actual record, the actual change record that's up on the screen. So if they're in phase XYZ or closure phase, this is going to be the current value of all the variables in that phase. The object is the actual object record, so like the CM3R object record. So if you needed to get something out of there to check something, you could pull it out of there. The phase, once again, that's the actual phase record. So if you wanted to check something in the phase record. Saved record, that's the record as it existed before you pulled it up and started messing with it. So that's like $file0, or like in a trigger, it'd be old record. Security, this is new. So the security scheme has changed a little bit in service in these content packs. A little more role-based. You can now use the security to apply more easily to buttons. So you can just say, hey, if they have the security of IT, change coordinator. And then a variable, so you can check a variable. So chances are you're going to be doing something like checking something in current record, or maybe in their security, or maybe checking something in current record versus saved record. But let's just walk through and see what this looks like to build a condition. So in the current record, now I have a selection of all the fields in the current record. So, and this is basically what the labels of the fields are. So you can see, so now you don't really have to know, like in the format control, if you're adding a condition on update, you don't have to know what the actual field is called, like going and clicking Control-H or going figure out what the actual field name is. You just look at the label name. So if you're looking at the screen, most companies match up kind of what they have as a label on the screen with this label, DataDict label. So you can look, for instance, at the impact, and then you can say, well, is the impact equal, not equal, greater than or equal? So fairly simple to choose this. And then we can select equal to. Now we can select, once again, we choose out of the category object, the current record, so we can say, hey, if the impact is equal to, say, some other field in the current record, or if the impact is equal to what the impact was in the saved record. You can also check in the object the phase. So this is kind of the same, but now we're setting the other side in the equal. You can also set a value or a variable. So if we just look at value, impact. Now, if there is like a global list or something for this impact, it'll show up as a list. So this wizard's pretty smart. If it's just text, you just type in text. If it's a date, it'll show you the date. So we'll just put hi in here. Apply it. Oop. Okay, so that walks you through, and then it'll add this to that condition. Okay, so here I have an example in my slide deck. I've got an example of an actual downtime. So I have greater than or equal to the value, and then it gives you a little pick list for the date, and then a little drop down for the time. And the time drop downs, like if we go in and look at this, kind of the same thing. So some people, if you're a really good service manager developer, you might say, well, this is actually more work than writing code. And I would say, yeah, it is a little bit more work. Like me doing this for so long, I can just whip this stuff out right in code. But for somebody else to find it, somebody new, some other consultant to come in and look at it, this is just a lot easier to manage. So like, yeah, actual downtime and equals value. So you can kind of see this calendar widget comes up, and we can look for, the 13th at 4 o'clock, and we can change this to be like, say, 4:01. Okay, so that just gives you, so it separates the date time, which is nice. I know some customers have done that on their own. And you can combine expressions by using conditions. You can have lots and lots. So instead of having to manage the parentheses yourself, you can do it. You can group things. You can have big if/or statements, basically, without, once again, for me, because Service Manager doesn't have like the smart, like if you're in .NET or Java, you can do the parenthesis matching and all those different things. Service Manager doesn't really have that. So this really simplifies the parentheses and where to put them and how to group them, and just shows you them visually, basically. And this is kind of what we do with the finished product. You can see the parentheses in here. It's placed in the condition section of whatever you're working on. All right, so let's take a look at these rule sets. So rule sets are groups of business rules. You can group rules together, create a rule set with a single rule, and then rule sets are applied to the workflow engine at either the phase or the transition rule level. And so once rule sets are applied to phases or transitions, you only need to change the rule set to affect everywhere it's tied to. So the example I used before of a validation record where you say this, hey, this is our global validation. It's got 16 validations. Every change record needs these 16 fields filled out. And then the next month the business says, well, it's actually 17. So then all you have to do is you just edit that workflow rule, and it'll be changed across all your workflows. So if you're doing something now, maybe you've got a dozen change workflows, and you're actually doing separate workflows. If you have something like that, you probably have it in the CM3R, so maybe you have one place to change it. It's kind of a mishmash of validations. And we'll actually show you what validations look like. So here's a shot of the rule set screenshot. So let's go take a look at rule sets. I believe I've got these pulled up. So the first thing you see is all the different rule sets that HP provides. You can add your own rule sets. So I've got, this is a Stratacom rules, just Stratacom new rules. You give it an ID. This is available as action, so you can create a rule as a button, basically. So if it's an action, it'll show up under the actions tab of the rules. You give it a table. Right now, CM3R is basically what most, or knowledge would be the two things. So, and if we just add a rule, I'll just kind of show you, this works a lot like the condition editor. It's wizard driven. Here's all the different rules. I do have all the rules you can do in my slide deck. So you can see a lot of these are like launch a script. That's just an old script, the old school script. Run a wizard, so if you've got wizards that do a lot of things, you can create rules to call those wizards and then tie them to transitions or phases in your changes. Call a process, clear fields, run JavaScript. So if you've got tons of JavaScript libraries, you can put them in here. Set mandatory fields. We'll look at this one. Oops. I did not want mandatory variables. Let's take a look at mandatory fields. So once again, you have the condition editor. When is this field mandatory? Well, maybe when something in the current record is required. So say in the current record, if affected data set is something, then fire this validation. So it might just be true, you know. And then to make your fields required, just pop them in here. Okay, and then you just click OK, and these are required. You can give them a default value if you tell it pop up or screen. That's the same as in validations right now. Do you want them to pop up in a window or just show up on the top of the screen? So this greatly simplifies validations. That's why I say maybe even start with validations. Put them all in here because you can put them. And keep in mind, this is a single rule. So you can have multiple. So this is a single rule set. So you can have multiple rules. So multiple fields in a single validation. And then you can also have multiple rules inside of a rule set. So you can kind of build up these rule sets to be really big and have one spot to go. Or you can just have lots and lots and lots of different rule sets, and you say, well, I just want this field required to be a rule set. Then I can just drop it in whatever phase of transition I want. And you just create a rule set with basically one rule and one validation in it. Then you just drop it in. And keep in mind, if I want to add this rule to here, I just click Add. My list of, oh, I'm on Actions. I just click Add. My list of rules comes up. I just go in here and find it. STC new rule, I add it here, boom, my rule is added. So let's see what else I had in here. If we can quick go through. So here's the things you can do. One thing I just wanted to touch on is this send HTML email. That's also a content pack. You can find that in the link I've got for change. That's another hour demo all of itself. So brilliant HTML email editor. I know a lot of our consultants just do it right now. They just have their own JavaScript engines that they write for email, and this is a really nice HTML email engine. It's not included in 930. It is a content pack that you have to load. Completely painless to load it. It's all net new, so it doesn't really affect hardly anything. And then you can send these HTML emails through this rules engine. Oop. Yeah, so that's a lot of functionality. Of course, you can reuse existing things if you've got existing libraries, wizards, scripts, macros, process records that you already have. You can just tie them in with this new glue, I call it. You can also come up with new rules that will replace older functionality like validations. So here, setting a mandatory field, added to the rule set, and then the rule set change is applied. Okay. Questions? Do we have any questions?
Yep, we have a list of questions, Eric.
Okay.
Thank you very much. That was a wealth of content, and actually kind of exciting that maybe you don't have to be as deep a developer as yourself to be able to do this.
Yeah,
but
I would say definitely the easier things they've made a lot easier. And if you've got complex code that you maybe somebody like me wrote that's really complex, you can take that code and add it to this. I think it's really going to simplify companies that have existing systems and maybe make them a little bit more brave to build these things out a little bit more, because I wouldn't say anybody can do it, but you don't have to be an expert at Service Manager now to be able to add these rules.
I personally would still hire someone like you. So the first question that comes up is, are there workflows to incidents? For example, transitions between different states.
Right, so the incident content pack hasn't been released yet, so we don't know exactly, and HP won't even really tell us exactly what they're doing. But from talking to people at HP, my guess is that it's going to work a lot like change, where you can, if you want, have these different phases per se in incident. I'm not exactly sure how they're going to pull it off, if they're just going to add a phase record to incident or what exactly they're going to do. But it wouldn't be a very far stretch to add phases. So right now, most people are managing incidents via statuses, basically. But statuses, a lot of people manage change through statuses too instead of phases. So it's kind of the same concept. So in theory, incidents will be able to move through this kind of phased concept. Worst case, you just write rules to change statuses based on what happened. But I would really like to see incidents work like this, because to me, incidents can have workflow, and a lot of incidents do. So
okay. We have a couple of questions from people who are actually installed at 9.2 and asking if there's any way to install Process Designer at 9.2.
I don't. There might be a hack way, like unloading all the RAD core from 930 and loading it into 920. I don't know the answer to that. Be interested. We could try in a lab. As far as I know, you have to be on 930, but I'm not 100% sure. It might be possible to upgrade binaries to 930 and then get some RAD apps out of 930 and drop it into your existing 920 application. I think that the easy answer is not really. There might be a more complicated answer that's maybe with a combination. HP hasn't given any guidance to what that would be. But if you've ever hacked around in RAD, you know you can get new functionality out of RAD and just load it in old versions, and a lot of times it works. So,
yeah, I would call HP support and certainly ask that question if you have support.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say going to 930 is your best bet, but.
Yeah. Next question is, should there be a workflow for incident and/or interaction? By its nature, these process function cannot be predefined, thus stays high-level generic. I think that's more of a philosophical question.
Yeah, it's pretty philosophical. I mean, true. Especially for service, there's no real ITIL rules around this. So I'm guessing when it comes out, you're going to have more of a platter to work with for incident and interaction. I don't really know what they're going to do with that. So in theory, you could just have one, quote, phase in incident and just apply all your rules to it and just have a lot of rules. I mean, that's basically what you have to do now with the format controls. You're not moving through this phase concept. So yeah, I don't know what they're going to do with it. Maybe they'll come up with some workflow based on best practice that they'll let you. But it is literally so easy to do the workflow with this thing that you can whip out workflow in a couple of hours, for incident if you've got incident workflow. So.
Okay. We're currently implementing Service Manager 9.3 with change management process made on the new Process Designer. The next module will be request management. Do you have any idea when Process Designer support for the request module will be released?
I asked HP at the last Vivit conference I was at, and they didn't have a date. And HP, I don't know if there's HP people on here, but HP is not good at having dates. I'm guessing it's probably going to come out before Discover in June. But I do know a couple things. I do know that they're enhancing how change on Process Designer works. So they've got resources doing that. I'm not exactly sure what they're adding to it. It's pretty complete, but there's still a few things that I'd like to see added to it. Request I have heard is the next thing coming out. I've also heard problem management's the next thing coming out. So I don't know if they're going to release them one after the other, if they have two different groups. I don't have any dates. I'm not sure if someone like Patrick or somebody can give dates on it. Usually
yeah, they can't. I've asked HP, and typically they can validate that they're working on something, but yep, they're not allowed to give release dates.
Yeah, okay. And we're in a new quarter, so if they know something's going to be released this quarter, then they can talk about it. It's kind of this whole SOX compliance thing because they're publicly traded, but I believe if something's going to be released this quarter, they may be willing to talk about it. But if you've ever talked to HP about dates, their typical line is legally they can't, and it becomes a revenue recognition and all these other rules. It's not because they're trying to be jerks about it or anything. It's because of the SEC. So.
Right. Next question is, can this be done by users that are not sysadmin?
Yeah. Yes. Yep. So you can apply. Basically, down here, you give. This is in a menu. So yeah, if you give this access to somebody who's not sysadmin, they'll have access to it. So I don't know off the top of my head I don't think they need sysadmin to actually do this. I'm not sure. But HP intent behind this was to give more power to like somebody like maybe kind of a BA/developer, where they didn't have to be like a hardcore developer or to do this, or at least they could get in and play around, or even a BA could do something as simple as like, drag a transition, move it from, see if I can get this thing to move it from back out to post implementation. implementation. Do something like that simple. Where before in the older systems, that's a pretty complex thing to do. Where now, you may have BAs, maybe you've got workflow that changes, maybe you've got 100 workflows, and you're always changing them. So now somebody like a BA can say, hey, if I don't want this back out, I'll just remove it from the workflow, and that's how simple it is. So.
Okay. Is the process designer required, or can we function without it until we're comfortable with it?
Yeah, it's not required. So it's not included with 930 like for change for the specific module. So it's definitely not required. You can implement it, like if you're implementing change on 930 right now without Process Designer and you want to go with that, you can implement Process Designer somewhere down the road. And you can even implement Process Designer with no rules, just keep the phases and transitions and keep all your rules in your existing like format controls and things like that. And then you can move the rules when you're ready. So you can kind of do it piecemeal. So you can do and you can do the modules separately also. So this is not like in like doing a massive upgrade where you have to upgrade all the modules at once to get this functionality. You have to be on 930, but once you're on 930, you can kind of pick and choose what you do by module, and you can also pick and choose how much functionality you want. So if you say you just want to move all your validations to this, you can just move the validations, and then you want to move, say everything in calculations, I'm going to move to Process Designer. You can move your calculations. So you can do it piecemeal and then kind of manage that through your standard unload process and things like that. So you don't have to go in whole hog with this.
Okay. Next question is, there is no on-open rule set. So is there a rule set for on-open?
Well, on open, like in change, I assume they mean when the change is opened. Basically, that's the entrance rule on enter of your main form. So if I can get this to go over to the details tab, you can see this is the entrance phase for this form. It's got a little checkbox. So this is the phase that will be fired when this is opened. Oh yeah, here we go. So it's the default and first phase. So if we look at the rules for this, on enter of this phase, you can fire these rules. Now it is possible to come back to this phase from another phase. So you may have to put some logic on there that figures out if you're just opening this phase for the first time. But yeah, they've kind of, there is no on open basically because it's on enter of the first phase.
Okay. The next question is, I would like to know where the change category fires these workflows. Like if you are calling a JavaScript, you make a JS call. How are these rules invoked by specific change categories?
So the change category is basically, and they've changed a little bit. They've made it a little bit. We can go in here and look at change, but they've added admin. No, standard config. They've added these change models. And these change models, let's say activate patch, have things are tied to the category, and then you can put a template on them. And then the actual category is tied to the workflow. So whatever model you tie to your category, your category is tied to this workflow. So before you would tie a category to phases, right? You would say, hey, in this category, I've got all these phases, and they fire in this order. So now you're saying in your category, you assign it a workflow. Let's look at one of these categories. So this has got the hardware workflow. Here's the workflow. So this is the workflow that fires when you run this type of change. So, and then the models are applied to the categories. So you can have 50 different types of hardware changes, but they all follow the basic same workflow. So when you choose a category, if I go into change and choose a new category, this is what fires based on that category. Okay, so if I want to apply JavaScript to this workflow, where is my workflow? If I want to apply a JavaScript to this, like the Straticom workflow, I'll add it up. I pick what phase I want the JavaScript to fire on, and then I add it as a rule on one of these, on enter, exit, initialization, or in a transition. So I will say the one thing I hope HP adds is the ability to add a rule across all your phases and transitions, because currently you have to manually add them to every phase and transition. So if you've got a validation that you want on every single phase, but the fields are not read-only, you have to add it to each phase. There is no way that I know of to add a single rule set to all the phases. So it's kind of a ticky-tack thing that I'd like to see, because they had it with, this, like, say, the CM3R format control. But it's really easy to add these rules. So, I mean, the biggest thing is, like, on update, if you forget to add it to a phase. But that would come out in testing, and it's really easy to add back in. So I would like to see that. So the workflow fire is based on category, just like it does in today, where category, you know, you have the phases. Now categories have the phases and transitions in this workflow.
Okay. The next question is probably best for HP to predict, but current manuals do not cover all functionality of Process Designer. For example, phase options. Will that change in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. I thought the documentation was pretty good. That's how I learned this. I just went through the documentation. It was like a PDF. But honestly, I thought this thing was so simple. Of course, I know kind of the ins and outs, but I thought it was so simple how it worked that I just browsed through the documentation just to see what some of the terminology meant. Yeah, so I guess I can't comment on that. So.
Okay. Can you have one phase that looks at multiple fields from the change request and requires approvals according to values from the form? So many approvals to one stage.
Right. So there is this approval tab on the phase, and you can just start dropping approvals in here. Of course, the approvals are named. Now, the approvals still work like the approvals work. So you can have multiple approvals, but you still have to put your logic on the approval like you work with the approvals in the past. If I click View, I can see that approval. I still need an approval condition on here. So some of the approval stuff works the same way. What I'm hoping HP does is add some more of this conditional editor to some other the outline like approval. So if I add 10 different approvals to this phase, I still have to go back to the approval and say, you know, hey, when does this approval fire? So there's some functionality like that I think can still be added, putting the conditional editor on those approvals, or even putting the condition like in here somewhere. But so it basically still works the way it did before. We could have multiple approvals on a phase. It's just a little bit different way to access them.
Okay. And we're at the 9 o'clock hour here. Can I ask if you can spend a few more minutes?
Yeah, let's spend a few more minutes. See
Okay.
what else comes up.
Let's do a couple more questions here, and then the rest that we will, Eric will help answer, and we'll post on the Vivit website. Next question is, can you use the rules to query another table to validate the entry, such as a valid contact?
Yep, and you'll see in the slide deck, I ran out of time, so apologize. This is the first time I've done this presentation, so I didn't know how long it would take. I'm guessing I need about 3 hours. Yeah, when we add a rule, these are all the different things that you can do. You can launch your URL, you can set mandatory fields, all these different things, and some of the things towards the bottom that you probably couldn't see. You can validate a date against a date range. You can validate against a list, either global or defined. And these are all in the slide deck. You can validate a text or number against a text or number range, and you can validate against a table. So you can validate a field against another field in a table. So that's what he's asking you can do. So basically, in the format controller, you would query the table. Now you can actually do it. You can say, hey, validate service against this table. That would be device. And the other thing I hope they add is this more search capability to to some of these things. So a device, and then you can validate against a field, and you can put a filter in there. You can add fill information. So yeah, so it's a lot easier. It's more graphical now. Same basic functionality as validating against a query in a format control, where before you might have like $file6 and you're checking a field in that. Now, same concept, but it's a little easier to figure out. You don't have to know that, hey, query number 6 is $file6 in this format control, and they're format control specific, not thread specific, and all these different rules that you have to know. So that's how you validate against a database.
Okay. Well, there's a lot of great questions here. I'm going to give you a last question here.
Okay.
When you migrate existing tailoring and rules into process design or workflows, does that remove them from the traditional tailoring tools objects?
Well, yes, because it's going to be most of the rules you're going to have to migrate manually. So you are going to want to remove them. So I would say yes, because you're going to be doing it. So there is no way to like migrate, at least not yet, and I don't know if there ever will be, but to migrate, say, the validations out of a format control. For one thing, where would you even stick them, right? You stick them in a rule, but then you still have to apply the rule. So in my mind, it's so easy to write these rules that I think the toughest thing companies are going to have to deal with is that they've probably got such a mishmash of rules in their existing system. They probably don't even know, especially if they've been running it for a long time, they may not even know what rules are in use anymore. You know, they probably have a lot that are falsed out, a lot that they've changed. But so no, there's no automated way to remove them. You will have to remove them. Otherwise, like if you put all your validations in rules, but keep your validations in the format control, you're going to get double messages basically. And so.
Okay, well, I really appreciate you sharing Process Designer with us. It's an amazingly powerful looking piece of functionality added into 9.30. There are a number of additional questions, and Eric has made a commitment to take a look at these questions, answer them, and we'll get them posted online, the Vivit website here within the next week. Again, thank you, Eric, very much for sharing your knowledge today.
Okay, and you've got the slide deck, so you can just post it up to the website, and when will that be available?
I would say probably within the next week. It's usually within a couple of days
Okay.
of the webinar.
Sounds good.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.